He boarded the plane like any other teenager, nervous, excited, and proud of who he was. But within minutes, a single cruel act turned his joy into humiliation. A flight attendant didn't see him as a passenger or even as a child. She saw something else, something she thought she could erase with a pair of scissors. What happened next didn't just scar him, it shook an entire airline. How could one haircut expose the truth about power, prejudice, and justice in the skies? For Marcus, flying was supposed to be an adventure. At just 16, he had saved for months, working odd jobs and dreaming of the day he'd finally take his first solo trip. His father had hugged him at the gate, proud to see his son step into the world with confidence. Marcus wasn't just carrying a backpack. He carried his identity, his culture, and his pride in the locks that framed his face. On that morning, the airport buzzed with energy. Families rushed past, travelers wheeled suitcases, and Marcus, like any other teen, blended into the crowd. To him, this was freedom, a new city, new experiences, and the independence of doing something on his own. But even as he settled into his seat, something in the air felt off. A subtle shift, like a storm no one else could see. The flight attendant's glance lingered longer than it should have. Her smile was thin, her tone clipped. Marcus brushed it off. He was used to the stares, the unspoken judgments. Still, he had no idea that in just a few moments this flight would become less about travel and more about survival, less about where he was going, and more about what he was about to endure. Marcus leaned back into his seat, earbuds in, trying to lose himself in the music. For a moment, it worked. The engines roared, the plane rolled down the runway, and he felt that rush of excitement only a first flight can bring. But then, her shadow fell over him. The same attendant who had been watching him earlier stopped by his row, her eyes fixed, not on his ticket, not on his seatbelt, but on his hair. At first, Marcus thought he misheard. "Excuse me?" he asked, pulling out his earbuds. She repeated herself, sharper this time. His hairstyle violated policy. Marcus blinked, confused. He had read all the travel rules. Nowhere did it say dreadlocks weren't allowed. But before he could even respond, she reached into her pocket and pulled out a pair of scissors. The metallic snap echoed louder than the hum of the engines. Marcus froze, his heart slamming against his chest. Passengers turned their heads, whispers rising. Some frowned in disbelief. Others looked away, choosing silence over confrontation. Marcus wanted to move, to stop her, to speak, but shock glued him to his seat. And then, with a swift, merciless snip, the scissors sliced through the locks he had grown for years. The sound wasn't just hair being cut, it was dignity being stripped away. His chest tightened, his throat burned, and all he could think was, why? Why me? Tears blurred his vision, but the attendant's expression never softened. She tossed the severed lock into a trash bag as if it were nothing. A few rows back, someone muttered, "Unbelievable." But no one stood up. No one intervened. Marcus's hands shook as he touched the uneven ends of his hair, humiliation burning through him. Every second felt like an hour. He wanted to scream, but fear pressed down harder than anger. What if they called security? What if speaking up only made things worse? The minutes dragged on, the silence in the cabin louder than any engine roar. Marcus curled into his seat, wishing he could disappear. But deep down, something else stirred, an anger that refused to stay buried. When the plane finally landed, Marcus didn't rush out like the other passengers. He moved slowly, the weight of every eye in the cabin pressing on him. He knew this wasn't over. He couldn't let it be. At the terminal, his father was waiting, arms wide, smiling proudly, ready to hear about his son's first adventure. But when Marcus walked out, eyes red, hair uneven, the smile faded. In its place came a silence heavier than words. His father didn't need an explanation. He could see the truth carved into his son's face, and as the truth spilled out, piece by painful piece, something hardened in his father's eyes. The humiliation Marcus had endured wasn't just personal, it was systemic, and his father knew exactly what he had to do next. What began as a boy's first flight was about to turn into a battle that would shake an entire airline to its core. Marcus's father wasn't a man who raised his voice often, but when he did, people listened. That night, after hearing his son's trembling account, he picked up the phone and called the airline directly. What began as a simple customer complaint quickly turned into something much larger. His voice was steady, but the fury beneath it was unmistakable. He wasn't just speaking as a father, he was speaking as a man tired of watching his community be humiliated, silenced, and discarded. At first, the airline tried to brush him off. Policy this, misunderstanding that. But Marcus's father wouldn't back down. Every word cut deeper, painting the image of a boy humiliated in front of dozens of silent witnesses. A boy whose pride had been hacked away with a pair of scissors. He demanded accountability, not just for Marcus, but for every child who had been made to feel less than human in spaces meant to be safe. Then, something shifted. The call, which began with scripted apologies, soon reached executives who realized this wasn't going to disappear quietly. Social media was already buzzing with whispers from passengers who had recorded the incident. The story was spreading faster than they could contain, and at the center of it all was Marcus, his severed lock of hair now more than just a symbol of humiliation. It was proof of cruelty, proof of prejudice, proof of a system that thought it could get away with erasing identity in the name of policy. For the first time since that flight, Marcus didn't feel small. He sat beside his father, listening to the conviction in his voice, and realized this was no longer just his pain. This was a fight that could bring an entire airline to its knees. Because when one father refused to stay silent, the world started to listen. The fallout was swift. Within days, the airline faced headlines it couldn't escape, protests it couldn't ignore, and passengers demanding answers. The attendant was suspended, policies were reviewed, and a public apology was issued. On paper, it looked like justice. But for Marcus, no press release could undo the humiliation he had carried on that flight. The uneven strands of his hair grew back with time, but the memory of being stripped of his dignity in front of strangers never faded. Yet something else grew too: resilience. For Marcus, that moment became a reminder of who he was and why he could never let anyone define him by prejudice, and for his father it was proof that silence is never an option. One phone call turned private pain into public reckoning, showing the world that when voices rise together, power has no choice but to answer. But the deeper truth remains. Marcus's story is not rare. It is not an isolated incident. It is a reflection of a system where bias hides behind uniforms, policies, and polite smiles until it cuts, until it scars. His story echoes in schools, in workplaces, on streets, and in skies where freedom should belong to everyone. So the question lingers long after the headlines fade. How many more Marcuses will it take? How many more fathers must fight for their children's humanity before dignity is no longer negotiable? Because in the end, this isn't just about one boy on one plane. It's about all of us. And it's about whether we're willing to look away or finally stand up and say, enough. Disclaimer: the stories shared on this channel are works of fiction created solely for entertainment purposes. We stand for a world where all people enjoy equal rights under the law and where society advances in fairness, justice, and progress. Our goal is to present thought-provoking and meaningful stories that encourage positive change. Any resemblance to actual persons, events, or organizations is purely coincidental and unintentional. These stories do not reference real individuals or entities and carry no political or religious implications.